What's going on, everybody? James here from Artofficial Entertainment, and today I'm going to be covering the initial setup for the quick start of the dynamic parkour tray system version 3. So let's go ahead and dive in. Alright, now, a couple of things before we get started is that first thing is this is a quick start guide, meaning that I'm going to be kind of going through things a little bit faster, and I might be glossing over some other parts of the system. There is a more detailed guide for those of you who are looking to get more information, but this will get you definitely started and get you more familiarized with how the system works. Now, you can use any animations you like, but I will leave links to the one I'm going to be using in the descriptions. But just want to note that you can use any animations you like and follow along. You might just need to change a couple of offset values or something like that. But let's go ahead and let's start taking a look at how easy this is to set up. So the first thing we're going to want to do is if we go up in the top, click on Edit, Plugins, and then in the search bar here, type in Motion Warp, and you'll see this motion warping plugin that comes shipped with Unreal Engine. And we can click on this. It'll give you a message letting you know it's in beta, but that's okay. We can just click on yes, and then it's going to have you restart the editor. So this will bring the editor back or down and then bring it back up. So I'm going to click the restart button and we'll be right back. Alright, so we got our motion warping plugin added to our project, so we can close that. And now we need to go to our character. So whatever your character is, and for me that's going to be the third person blueprints, then BP third person character. Now there's going to be three main things that we're going to add to the character, and the first two are going to be components. So we're going to go into the Components tab here up in the top left, click on Add. We're first going to type in Motion Warp so we can add that motion warping plugin that we enabled. And then we're going to click on Add again and type in Parkour Trace, and you'll see the dynamic parkour trace system right here. So there we go. So now our two main components are added to our character. The next thing we want to do is up in the top, we're going to click on Class Settings, and then in the Details panel, we're going to navigate down to Interfaces, Implemented Interfaces, click on Add and type in DPTS, and you'll see the BPI right here. Now once we click on this, it'll add it to our character, and we can note this by under the My Blueprint section, we can see an Interfaces section has now been added. So what we're going to do is under this Set Data, we're going to open this up, and then we're going to double click to open the Set System Use Transform. So this is going to set basically the starting orientation and location for the system's main searches. And I recommend just using the actor transform. However, I expose this pin so that way you guys can, play around and find different transforms, and, who knows, you might find something that works better for your type of project. Now, the last thing that we're going to need to do is we're going into our event graph. We need to figure out how we're going to call the system. There's two main ways that we can do this. The first way is we can create just a custom input, like for example, a keyboard event E, and I could call it off of this if I wanted to. However, we can also use the jump input, and it actually has its own internal jump override that it'll use if no action is found, giving us a little bit more of a dynamic selection. Now, I'm going to be using the jump input for this demonstration, but if you're not looking to use the jump input and you want to set up your own, you can go ahead under the dynamic parkour trace system in the components section, and then in the details section down here near the bottom, we can see the switches/modifications, and you can see that use jump on fail is checked by default. If you uncheck this, no jump will be taken, but if you're using the jump override, we want to make sure that this is checked. Now, we're just going to pull down the stop jumping here, and we're going to delete this jump function out completely. We're going to grab our parkour system here and pull it into our graph, and we're going to pull off and get two different values. The first one is going to be busy, and this is the internal blocker when the system is trying to attempt an action. And we're going to take a branch, hook up the condition, and then we're going to hook up this branch off of started. Very important, make sure that you have it off of started, not triggered. Now the next thing we're going to grab is we're going to pull out the parkour trace system, and if busy is false, we're going to search for parkour, and you'll see the search for parkour action function right here. So make sure to grab the regular one, not one of the ones with the RPC events. Now we'll grab that and we'll just kind of make it a little bit more even. So there we go. So now we've added the system to our character, we've added the motion warping, and we've actually added the primary call. So that's pretty much the primary setup here. Now we need to make it so that way we can take a look at the system's traces and searches so we can make sure everything looks proper. Now if we go into the dynamic parkour trace system here, under the system secondary settings, you see that we have this debug settings option. And then under the trace search options, we're going to open this up and you'll see there's a search type selection. So if we click on and add an element, you'll see there's a drop down here. And these are all the primary search options within the system. And we can select these either one at a time or in groups to be able to, take a look at certain traces and searches individually. So for this instance, I'm going to set the frontal block search and the ground validation search. And we also want to make sure that the enable trace debug is checked. Now, outside of being able to take a look at where the traces are going to, we can also take a look at any of the found targets that the system has found, just by clicking on this Show Targets option. Now, by default, the system is going to be able to find things like height and length and the distance to the initial hit point, but there's a ton of values that can be used. If we open up under the target debug listing here, and if we actually hold shift and click that arrow, we can open all these up. You can see that the debug color yellow is going to be for height, blue is going to represent the length, red being the initial, orange being a sidewall, either left or right, and then as well as this aqua color for drop start. So we can use this to be able to take a look at what targets are being found, and the colors just represent what the target is. So if we just go compile and save, minimize, and then we just hit play, if I press the spacebar, you're going to see that we can have a trace going down across the ground, another one going out and forward. And if I went up to this object here and press the spacebar, you can see we have a red, yellow, and blue sphere indicating initial, height, and length. And if I went up to this object, I can do the same thing. We see that we have a sidewall being found there with that little orange marker. So what these are representing the targets that can be used for motion warping. Now, we'll get deeper into the motion warping stuff when we get to the animation stuff, but I just want to note that these are the targets that you can use, and it's a great thing to keep in mind that keeping the targets being shown while you're setting up animations allows you to be able to see, like, if I'm doing a vault or a mantle, for example, actually in this case, I would want to use the height point as where I'd want to go up to, but I might want to use that initial point to get me there. So there's different ways that you can use these inside of motion warping, which again, we'll cover more in a little bit. Now, let's take a quick look at the way that you can change the way that some of these tracers are going to work. Now, you can see we have heights and lengths and a whole bunch of things that are happening, right? So if we go into the DPTS assets folder, selection tables, and then double click on the settings folder, you'll see this DPTS settings selection table. Now, if we open this up, you'll see that we have a from ground state, we have climb, wall run, and ledge catch. But under the primary search settings from the from ground state, you can see we have the frontal block options, the floor validation. We also have some enclosure settings, which the enclosure and sidewall can actually be disabled if you would like, but they are enabled by default. And then the secondary search settings here allow us to control values about the searches that are going to happen if a ground is not valid. So if I, for example, delete this wall, if we were to try to do something over here, right, there's no valid floor here. It's kind of going to stop right along this edge. So that's going to be sort of the type of thing it's going to search for, is how far down to be able to find a drop target. Is this max distance? Then we also have the search size. Then we have a offset values and all that good stuff. But if we open up the frontal block object settings here, we can also see we have a search height, distance, offsets. So you can play around with these. And again, just kind of keeping in mind those debug options where you can look at different traces. So you can highlight different traces to be viewed, and then use the settings here to be able to kind of mess around with them individually until you're happy with how they're going to be assessing your environment. Now, one other thing that's very important is if we open up under the from ground state secondary search settings, you're going to see there's a second menu under the jump from drop off settings called dynamic jump. Now, you can see that by default it is checked. Now, in a situation where this would be used is that if I just duplicate this platform here, and I just make this a little bit smaller, I'm just going to make it like a small gap. So in normal instance, you can see this is my normal jump. However, if I go over to this object, because dynamic jump is selected, you can see that it's doing a targeted velocity amount. It's not doing the normal jump. It's doing whatever it takes to get me from point A to point B. And if I make this gap a little bit larger, the same thing will occur, where it'll take me from point A to point B. And it'll kind of give us the ability to boost the velocity a little bit using this jump boost multiplier. 0.3 I found to be a good value, but if I raise it up to like 0.5, for example, you'll notice that he's going to go substantially past that initial point. So he's getting into a bit of a safer distance, but at the same time, if you want to get him on the edge, this can be, maybe a bit too far. Now, if you don't want to use dynamic jump at all and you just want to use your standard jumping system, just setting that to false will be enough. And then from here, the only thing that will happen is your standard jump. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how the anim selection works. Now this is going to be primarily in the character, but there is an additional spot that we're going to take a look at after. But first, let's go to our character, which for me is third person blueprints BP third person character. We'll open up, navigate to some empty space in our graph here. Now, if we go into the interfaces section under my blueprint, under action events, open this up, you can see that we have execute, vault mantle, wall run jump, drop off actions, a whole bunch of different things that we can call in the actual execution events for. And if I actually grab our parkour system, pull it in, pull off of it, and I just type in anim selection, you're going to see that we actually have corresponding anim selection functions that we can call as well. So in this case, if I call the anim selection vault mantle, I can then double click on this execute vault mantle action. And when an area has been found that, under varied conditions, this will allow this action to be taken. So it'll execute from here into this function. Now you'll note that there's a row use index and there's the compare values, and there's also a priority. Now every single anim selection has one of these options. Just to kind of prove the point here, I'll add another one for the drop off area action, and I'll grab the parkour system here, pull off, and we'll go anim selection, and we'll grab the drop off action here. And you can see that we have the row use index, compare values, and priority, just like the other. Now, the way that this works is that you're going to set your animations inside of an actual data table, but the values that it's going to use to select inside of that data table can be fed in from here. So if we pull off the compare values here and just type a make array, this will allow us to be able to input as many values as we want for the system to compare against for animation selection. So I'm just going to Control D to duplicate the array here, just so that way we have one on each one. And we'll go ahead and compile and save. And now we're going to take a look at the actual anim selectors. So if we go to the DPTS assets folder, selection tables, and we're going to open up under the from ground state, and then the vault mantle selection table. Now yours might have a demo use in here. I took mine out before recording, so this is something you can take out if you would like. It's only going to affect the demo character ability to select from the actions, but if you're not using it, it really doesn't matter. So, but we can go ahead and just click on add, and you can see that this will add a new row, which is kind of the first marker that we want to talk about, is that if we look in the character, we have this row use index. Now, each data table has the ability to add multiple rows, and each row has its own animation selection assignments. As you can see here, I just added 3 indexes in here, and each one of these is its own selection. Now, the way that you would use the varied rows is like if you had animations that you wanted to use with a pistol out or a sword out or under varied other conditions, you can change the row that it's going to use through this value here. Now, in the selector here, if I go back to it, and if I look at the compare values here, you'll see that it also allows us to be able to make an array. And if I add an element, you can see that we have a min and max value. So what this is going to basically mean is that if we, for example, for the vault mantle here, if I pull off on the dynamic parkour tray system, and I type in temp values, just kind of close the booleans here, you can see that we have a ton of values to choose from. Now, the ones that are specifically named, such as drop or climb, these ones are specific to the actions that they're tied to. So in other words, drop is going to be for drops only, climb jumps is going to be for climb jumps only. But there are more generic ones such as height and length, which we can actually use for the vault here. So I'm going to get the height, and then I'm going to pull off again, and then I'm going to get length. Now, what these values are going to represent is how high up the object is, and then how long its forward area is. So if we were to come at this cube from this side, how long this side of it is. So this is good for like differentiating between vault and mantle type actions. But this will make more sense here in a moment, I'm sure. If it's not already, that is. So now with these values fed in, you can also put in your own custom values, by the way. You don't need to just use ones that are in on the system. So you can add in, speed or rotation values, whatever you want to do. But with these in place, if we go back to the vault mantle selection, and let's say I add one more value here, right? In the character, we've set height as 0, length as 1. Inside of the selector itself, we can now know that this index is for 0 is height, and this index for 1 is length. So for height, let's say I go between 40 and 150, because we can define ranges here. And then for the length, if I'm setting up a vault, for example, I would want it to be more of a narrower object, so I'll go between 10 and 50. Now, there's additional ways to be able to modify action selection using the action modification options here. Now, just as a brief overview though, we have primary modification, which allows us to be able to select actions if sprinting is set to true, if a sidewall has been found either left or right, as well as various enclosure conditions. Now, on top of being able to select a primary value, we also have the secondary modification here as well, where we can set an and or match condition, and then a second value from that same listing. So for example, we could set sprinting and sidewall, and this will only, this particular action would only trigger when sidewall left and sprint are both true. But you can always, you can mix and match these and set varied conditions up. It's entirely up to you. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is going to be the montage selection. So inside of here, we can add one value, and we can use this as the selection if, the compare values are in the range that we defined and the action modifications that have been set have been matched. However, we can add more than one value if we would like, and this will randomly select between the animations. So it's a randomizer built in, but if you only want it to select one animation, just put one animation into the listing. Now, the action name here is optional as it states, and this is more just for your own knowing of what each animation is. So I could name this standard vault, and that way I know that this animation is tied, or this particular listing is tied to a standard vault selection. Now, if we go back to the character really quick, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the anim selectors before we start actually setting up animations themselves is going to be the priority here. Now, as I discussed, we have the compare values that we can feed in a value and see if it's within a range to be selected on each specific animation. However, we also have those action modifications that we can use as well. What this priority is used for is if a value has been found, for example, if you have two animations that use the same compare values. However, one uses a modification and one does not. If you have this set to compare value, it'll actually just select the first of those two animations. However, if we use modification, in this case, it'll prioritize, find the modification on the other animation and select that one. So it's basically, if you're using any of the modifications, you're going to want to make sure priority is set that way. However, if you're just going to be using the standard compare value system, you can just set it to compare values. It's entirely up to you. And really quick, we'll just go ahead and pull off the parkour system here for the drop area action. And we're going to get the drop distance, because this is going to allow us to be able to easily set up the drop actions. So that way I can show you guys the anim selection, the warp setup for both types of actions. All right, so let's go ahead and set up a very basic vault animation now so we can start looking at warp setup. So if I go into my animations folder here, I have this parkour folder here, and then I got some montages. Now, a couple of things just to point out about the animations. First thing is, you want to make sure your animations have root motion, and then you want to make sure that root motion is set to enable. So if I open up, for example, the monkey drop here, and I just go into the search bar and type in root, you're going to see that enable root motion is checked. Now, if I uncheck this, you can see that the character starts to move off of that in-place position. This also tells me that there is root motion. Just to point out, though, that that particular way of being able to define if root motion exists or not is really only needed if you're using an older version of Unreal. For example, this is an Unreal Engine 5.1. I believe 5.3 and above, they have the root motion previewer. But so long as you have that root motion enabled checked, the next thing you're just going to want to do is just right-click and create anim montage for all the animations that you're going to be using. Now, in this montages folder here, I do have them created, so we can just go ahead and open up the safety vault. Now, the first thing we're going to want to probably do is make a few notify tracks, which I do have here. So you can see we have 1, 2, and 3, and you can add them just by clicking on the track option here and then add notify track. Like I said, we're going to be working on the warps now. So if we go and right click, add notify state, you're going to see this option AN motion warp with offset. And as I talked about earlier, we have those target points like of height and length and sidewall, initial, drop start. So what we can do is actually use those as target points and move our animation to those points while the animation is actually in play. So the school of thought with this is that if we start off in the beginning of the animation and we go forward to where he's about to hit the plant, right? So right about here, this distance might change based off of the object. So if I were to grab 2 cubes and put them into the world here, right? So if I do this, so one's intersected into the ground, one's right on top of it. So these have 2 different height values for the top, which means that the starting point for the animation would be different for each one of these objects. So we want to make sure that we get the actor to that area, and then we can let the root motion carry for a little bit before taking over again. But the main thing to remember is that you only need to control the sections that get to the object, and then you can use the root motion to be able to go over afterwards. But obviously, there are more ways to be able to set it up as well. But that's just kind of the basic school of thought, is looking at, okay, what part of the animation do I need to modify to get it to the target point, and then just assign that window. So again, we can see that this is where he plants, so this is where I'll put my window end. And for those of you who have never used motion warping before, it's basically just the ability to move the character from A to B using the root motion. And that A is just wherever they start, which is the beginning of the window, and the B is going to be a target point that's assigned. So if we open up the root motion modifier here, we have this warp target name. Now inside of the system, you have height, length, sidewall underscore R, sidewall underscore L, initial, and drop start, as well as land. Now land is something we're going to assign inside of the animation, but if you ever need to take a look at what the target points are, it is inside of the documentation. But we can also take a look at this really quickly if we open up our character blueprint, and then if we double click on any of the animation selectors, so like these functions here, it'll bring you into the actual parkour system. But under the macros, you'll see this warp names. So this is a way that you can also identify what the warps are. Now bear in mind that these are all in lowercase just to make it easier and more consistent. With that in mind, I can go ahead and set the warp target name here to height. Now I'm going to uncheck ignore Z axes because this is going to basically make it so that way the actor's Z location maintains consistent. I don't want that. I want to make it so that we can go up and down as well. And then we're also going to uncheck warp rotation, something I recommend doing for all of the ground type actions because we really just want to let the animation's rotation control things because it helps with the blending. Now from here, what we can do is let our root motion take over a little bit, but we might want to move our character back a little bit, but we'll take a look at that after. You can see here he does kind of get to a landing position. Now, again, if we were to start up here, the height for that land would be different from here than it would be from here. So again, that's another thing we're going to want to maybe find is going to be the land spot, which we can easily do by right-clicking in the notifies section, add notify, and you'll see this AN find land target. Now, just like with the motion warping here, we have the ability to set a start point for our land trace. Now, the school of thought here is just logic. If you're doing a vault, you probably want to start on the length because that's the other side of the object. If you're doing a mantle, you'd want to start on the height because you're trying to get on top of the object. So we'll go ahead and just type in length into the starting here. Now for the offset, again, just logically thinking, if you're starting at the length, you want to go to the other side. Well, we're going to push you forward 20 units so we don't intersect with the actual object we're vaulting over. If we were to use the height instead, we might want to raise it up a little bit for that same purpose. Now, just also noting you can do a rotation offset here as well, but I do not recommend using it. But yeah, you can always mess around with it to see what results end up coming about. And then the last two options here, the max land search Z distance and the land forward position search. These two together can create a dynamic landing position. Just to put it simply, if we set this value to, let's say, 350, and we set these two values to, let's say, 90 and 150. The way that this is going to work is that this is how far down it's going to search, and this is how far forward it's going to try and search. However, this value here is going to control which of these two values it ends up using. So just to put it as simply as I can, when you're doing a landing search, if 350 units, so let's say this is about, I think it's 200. So if I were to actually set this to 200, just as a better example. Right, so if I were to jump off of this, do a vault off of this from this height, it's going to push my landing distance, rather than being at 90, it's going to push it closer to 150. Now, the landing forward will never go more than these min or max values. So I just want to note that you'll never have to worry about exceeding or being less than these forward position values that you set. But how close it is to this max land distance is going to be how close it's going to select between these two values. So if it's 200, it's going to be 150. But if it's less than 200, closer to 90, then it's going to choose 90. But if it's less than 90, it's never going to go less than 90 on the forward search. Now that's just to be able to make it dynamic, so it might change based off of the height. But if you want to make it static, make these two numbers the exact same, and you will always have the same landing location. So it's entirely up to you, but I just want to point out that you can create a dynamic position search by using these values and just creating a range. Now I'm going to set the Z distance to 250. And then from here, all we need to do is go right click, add notify state, motion warp with offset. And we're going to look at where he kind of falls off the item here. So I'd say right about there, and we'll look at where he does his plant. Now, just a quick trick here is we can look at where the knee begins to bend again. So I'd say right about there is going to be where he hits the ground. Now we'll open up the root motion modifier, and this is where we're going to use our land target. Now we used this notify to actually create the land target. So now we can use this offset window to apply it. So inside of the warp target name, we'll just set on land, and then unchecking ignore Z axes and warp rotation. Now, the last thing we're going to need to do is at the end here, we're going to right click, add notify, and you're going to see this one AN reset parkour action. This needs to be at the end of every action you're going to be adding from the system because it's the primary search reset. If you guys remember in the beginning, we had set that busy boolean to be able to make it so we could not do searches if that is true. This notify resets that value. Now, the other thing is that we have a custom blend that I've added into here. So I'm going to set this blend to 0.2, but if we go into the asset details panel here, under the blend options, we're going to make sure that enable auto blend out is unchecked. This is also very important because you may not achieve the right results unless you disable this and use this instead. because I found that being able to cut the animation at a certain point actually really does create some really interesting fluidity and some different options, because this will stop the animation at the point that you assign and blend out. So this way you can create a nice smooth transition at the point of your choosing. So if we were to just hit save now, minimize, go into our content browser, DPTS assets, selection tables, and then we're going to open up the from ground state vault mantle. Now we had set up these values to be, kind of reasonable for a standard vault here. So I can just go ahead and plug in the safety vault that we created right into there. So now if I minimize this, I'm going to delete this cube that's in the ground here, but I'm going to narrow this out, widen it out, make it more of like a vault object. Now, just really quickly, almost forgot, if we go back to our BP third person character, we want to make sure we set these actions to be enabled. So that's the last thing we're going to do here, is making sure that these are enabled. So I apologize. I've done so many videos in the last several days. I will say my brain is a little fried, so I apologize. But if we go into the dynamic parkour trace system in the character, under the settings, secondary settings, you're going to see this allowed actions listing. And we're going to want to make sure to check off any actions we're going to be using, which for right now is just really the vault and mantle. So we compile and save, and then now minimize, hit play. You can see that we are doing a vault action. Now, if we take a look at the character, you can see that he's maybe going a little too far forward. We might want to bring him back a little bit, so that way he's more on the area. And we can do this very easily. So if I go back to the animation that we were using for that safety vault here, open up the motion warp with offset, primary offsets. We can take the forward offset here, and we can go like -50, just to move him back 50 units. Now, if I play now, you can see that his hand starts more farther back, closer to the beginning. Now, you can play around with this value as much as you want, but this is how the offsets work, is that it's going to take whatever target you've assigned and then give you the ability to control where that target is actually going to be set inside of the window. What this does is allow you to be able to use height like 4, 5, 6 times if you want. You can use length in multiple ways. You can use each target point more than once with different offsets, and this is kind of the beauty of it, because you can control the animations as much or as little as you would like. Now, as I had said before, a lot of these animations and stuff are going to be set up pretty much the exact same way with a slight bit of variation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to widen out this object, and we're going to go ahead and set up the mantle action now. So this is going to be this two-hand on animation. So unlike with the vault where we're going to be going over it, this one's actually going to be going on top of it. So let's go ahead and take a look. So under the notifies track, we're going to add a couple notifies. And then in the blend options under the asset details, we're going to make sure enable auto blend out is unchecked. So this way we're kind of doing the first two things right out of the way. Now, if we analyze the animation here, we can see that right about there is when he plants on top of the mantle spot. So if we go right click, add notify state, motion warp with offset, and we can just go ahead and put our first window right there. And because again, we're doing a mantle, so we'll just set this as the height. And then make sure to uncheck ignore z-axes and uncheck warp rotation. And we're going to leave the offsets blank for right now, but we are going to have to mess with them a little bit, but we'll just leave them blank for right now. And then we are going to though right click, add notify, and find a land target. Now, as I had said before, with a mantle, for the trace start, we're going to want to use the height, not the length. And then we're going to take the trace start offset and move it up instead of forward by 20 units. So this way it can kind of go up from the area and trace for that forward position. Now, speaking of the forward position, we're going to go into the search distance here, and I'm going to set it to 60 because it's a mantle. I don't really want it to go like too far down. And then the minimum and maximum, I'm going to set to be, I don't know, between 30 and 90. Nothing too crazy because, again, we are doing a mantle. We want to be a little closer to the edge area, but not too far. And then we'll look at where he kind of does his full forward, which I'd say would be probably about there is about as forward as he's going to go. Then add notify state, motion warp with offset. And you can see now, like, it really is just a repetitive, okay, we're going to use the height here or the length here, or, we're going to search this far down, or we're going to land this far forward. It's really just all a game of metrics. Because if we look at, let's say we'll take it back right about there. And then right here, we're going to right click, add notify, reset parkour action, set the blend time to 0.2. And there we go. Now, one thing I want to cover really quick as well, because I almost forgot about, is the movement mode here. Now, in the last one, you saw we set it to none. We did not change anything. And by default, if it's set to none, it's just going to go to falling. However, if you wanted to use walking or another movement mode, if you have customs, you can go ahead and select it in here as well. But by default, if this is set to none, it's just going to go into falling. It's not actually putting you in none. Now, we'll save this, and we'll go and work on our offsets now. So for this one, Oh, it's this one. Okay, so we got to set the land one here. So we'll go ahead and make the warp target name land, ignore z-axis and warp rotation uncheck. There we go, okay, because I saw this little, doesn't have a valid name, so. Now let's go into our vault mantle selection. Now we're just going to add another element into our little index here. Now a way that we can kind of speed up some of this process here is that if, let's say, for example, we wanted to copy a specific value from the data table here, we can actually hold shift and right click on, let's say, for example, the compare values and shift left click to be able to copy them from index 0 to index 1, which you can see now we have those values. And the only thing I'm really going to change is going to be the length here. So remember, 0 is height, 1 is length. So we can change the length to be, I don't know, between 50 and 350, right? Because this is going to be a mantle, not a vault. And then we can go ahead in the montage section here, add an element, and then the two hand are on. And then save. So now if we hit play, hit the space key, you can see that we just did a mantle action. We're kind of going up on top. Now we might want to define the windows a little bit better, you know, maybe push the timing when he actually goes to the point a little more forward. Something like this. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. But you can see here, we might want to adjust the offset. So I'm actually going to take the offsets forward, and I'm going to make it again just -50. So this is where, you know, you just kind of take a look at how things look. And I think that actually looks a hell of a lot better. A lot smoother, just kind of jumping up on top of the area. So there we go. So now we have a vault and a mantle. And you can see the only thing we really did is change some of the targets and we changed some of the offsets. But realistically, a lot of the stuff is pretty much the same. Now let's take a look at a drop action. Now these are a little bit different, but again, not by a lot. If we go ahead, add notify track, add another notify track, enable auto blend out, uncheck, and then we're going to right click, add notify state, motion warp with offset. Now, the thing is that this is a drop action, meaning that the ground has been invalidated. It's either going to mean that the pitch of the area found is outside of the character's set walkable floor angle, or it's outside of a range that has been defined in the settings, which I'm going to cover here in just a moment. But the drop is going to, for example, in an area like this, it's going to drop down from up here on this platform down to here on this platform. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at where he gets to that plant point, just like we did with the others, but you can see he's going down in front of himself. Now, if I go over to this object and just press the space key, you can see that little aqua sphere. So that's our drop start. And we can use that as our starting point. So if I go to the root motion modifier and we're just type in drop start. And then we're going to do the uncheck, ignore z-axis, uncheck warp rotation, right click, add notify, and go with define land target. Now again, because this is a drop action, I want this to be tracing downwards a little further down. So I'm going to start from the drop start for the target. The forward offset I'll set to 20. The max Z land is going to be, I'll set to 350. And then we'll go 120 minimum, 250 maximum. And then if I right click, add notify state. And this time we're just going to go with the motion warp with offset again. And we'll look at where it kind of goes off the, I think that's actually a pretty good lineup. And then we'll kind of just place it towards the end here, because you can see that this animation doesn't actually end in a land. It kind of just enters into a falling state. But that doesn't mean we can't use this to be able to land. So if we go into the root motion modifier here, we'll just set that warp target name to land, uncheck ignore z-axis and warp rotation. Now under the primary offsets, I recommend taking the up offset, raising it to about 5. This is something that with animations like this that are actually ending in a falling state, this just seemed to help blend out the transitions. But if we right click and then add notify, reset parkour action, blend time 0.2, and then we hit save. So that's all we need to do for the drop action there. So if I go into my DPTS assets selection table, from ground state, the drop off actions, just like with the vault mantle here, I'm going to go ahead and add a row. Inside of that row, I'm just going to add an element. Inside of that element, I'm going to open up the index. You can see that we have pretty much the exact same values. We have some comparison values, we have some modification values, and all that good stuff. Now, for the drop actions, if you remember, we set these up with only using the drop distance, or at least I did. So I'm just going to set a single compare value inside of here, and I'm just going to leave it at 0. Because we're just setting up the one action. So I really don't need to set compare values, but just, remember, you can always set it to be like between 75 and 350, and then anything, you can set up range values for selection, basically. And then the montage here, we'll just go ahead and get the drop, and then we'll save. Now, actually, we do need to go back to our character, click on the dynamic parkour trace system, secondary settings, and then the allowed actions. Make sure drop off action here is checked. Because now if we compile, save, and we go back to this actor here, and we press the space key, you can see that it does the drop. So now we can mantle, we can vault, and we can drop. So really quickly, the ground validation stuff I do want to cover, just so that way you guys know how this works. Now, as I said, it's based off of a validation of like a pitch. So inside of your character movement settings, there is a walkable floor angle setting that is on every character movement. But as I had said also, there is a distance check. So if we open up under the DPTS assets, selection tables, settings, and the DPTS settings, we're going to open up under the primary search settings, floor validation, and you're going to see this value here for the max search Z length. So you can see right here, this is set to 150 by default. Now what this is going to mean is that it'll trace 150 units down, but thing to note is that if I press the spacebar here, you can see that it traces down and continues on. But if I go over to here, you can see that it does not. The reason being is that 150, if you take that and cut it in half, that is your minimum drop distance. So if I take 150 and just put a /2 or divide by 2, you can see that I've set my minimum drop distance to be 75. So what you can do is if you have a metric for what you want your minimum drop distance to be, like for example 120, you can just go multiply by 2 and there you go. So 240 is going to be what you'd want to search. So I just want to make sure to note that it's a distance as well as the ability to look at whether or not the pitch and the walkable floor angle is correct. So that's really it for the warp setup, guys. You know, when it comes down to it, like I said, you know, a few times now, it's just all about looking at what points you want to use, maybe setting some offsets, defining your animations, and then throwing them in your selectors. You know, and every single animation selector has a matching execution function, so you can just kind of play matchy-matchy for, you know, between execute this and anim select that. Now, if you guys have any questions, concerns, comments, issues, you know, anything going on, feel free to hit me up. I'm more active in the Discord, but, you know, I do try to monitor the YouTube comments. And in the next video, we're going to be taking a quick look at the modifications and ways that you can set up actions using some of the other stuff within the system. So hope you guys are excited. I know I am. I'm going to see you in that one. But until then, stay tuned. And as always, stay animated.